All right. And let's see. Please be respectful to everyone on here. We're just going to use, our best and most loving manners. And now I'm going to do my plug. Are you ready for the plug, everybody? May is Nebraska Bird Month. It's an exciting time. Nebraska Bird Month is a month-long celebration on birds, birding, bird migration, and there are events all across the state. If you head over to our the website here, nebraskabirdmonth.org, there are a list. There's all the events that are registered with Nebraska Bird Month are on that website. There's also birding resources, birding information, all sorts of great things. We also have all the events, most of the events on our Facebook and Instagram pages. And our handle is at NGPC Wildlife Education. And you should follow us because we're awesome. We're hilarious. We post every day, and we have great information about wildlife of Nebraska, fish and wildlife of Nebraska. I highly recommend it because it's a good time. One of the really cool things that's happening for Nebraska Bird Month is the 2022 Bird Blitz. And we are using the crowdsourcing data and community science app called iNaturalist. And here's just a little infographic on how you use iNaturalist. It's a website and an app. You can download the app for free onto your phone. It's super easy. After you download the app, you register an account, and you just take pictures and upload those pictures as observations, and your information goes towards helping learn about wildlife in Nebraska and all over the world. You are actually helping with real science, the experts, because there's not enough money, there's not enough resources, there's just not enough people to gather all the data that we want to know about the world around us. So this is a way as a community scientist to do that. And as of today, the Nebraska Bird Month Bird Blitz has 640 observations, and we're only 10 days in, so that's really exciting. Here we go, 668 observations. This is the front page on the iNaturalist account. And we have 140 species so far, and 102 observers. So 102 people making observations. But what's even cooler than that is that we have 155 identifiers. So those are people that are making those identifications. So if you don't know what a bird is, you can just upload your picture, and people in the community science in the iNaturalist community will confirm or refine your ID. So that's a really cool thing about iNaturalist, because you learn about identification. And I think I ran through all that. Now, you were all here, in case you were wondering, for bird migration in Nebraska, Survival by Degrees, by ours here, Steve Brenner. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to let you tell a little bit about yourself, Steve, and then I'm going to let you take it away. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. First thing.
Yes.
Let me try sharing my screen. Can you give me the...
of course. Yes, I can do that.
Yes, thank you.
That's important. Did that work?
Oh, sure.
Oh, sure.
All right. Does everyone see a beautiful ferruginous hawk by any chance?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and now, does it look like a slideshow with a goldfinch on it? All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you, everyone, for coming here this evening. This is one of my favorite topics, and I think one of the most interesting topics really in the natural world. We are talking about bird migration, really one of the great spectacles of our natural world. For those that don't know, I'm Stephen Brenner. I am an avian biologist with Nebraska Audubon, and also partner with Nebraska Game and Parks as well. And just kind of started at Audubon about 6 months or so ago, but still plenty to draw from the wonderful well of research here about birds in Nebraska. This talk, apart from covering migration, we're going to get a little bit into climate change and how that may be impacting and what what we may expect and what we've seen so far as the impacts on birds and their migration. And so without further ado, let's get right into it. So just to get everybody on the same page, a lot of this will probably not be new to anybody, but the whole deal with bird migration. So why would birds do it? So essentially the biggest thing is to capitalize on resources at different times of the year. So, you could always hang out, some birds are stay in the same place throughout the entire year. That's fine, whatever works for them. But there are advantages to, say, this is the range map of a black-throated blue warbler going from, the Caribbean to, in Central America, all the way up to sort of Northeast North America. And the reason to do this is to take advantage, of course, of spring, summertime, lots and lots of bugs, lots of things coming out, a really good time to be there. And then, of course, you can head back down to the warmer climates when winter comes and everything goes away. And so that's why birds do what they do. So, of course, there's sort of the winter time, wintering grounds. You're going to fly up north in your spring migration, eventually make your way. Well, no, you're not going to go back to winter. There we go. Eventually make your way to the breeding grounds in the summer. And then you're going to do it all over again, but in the reverse direction, head on south in autumn migration, and then eventually back to the wintering grounds. I am, of course, doing this from a northern hemispheric perspective, specifically North America. So, it's all upside down if we were, in Australia or something, but this is going to be a North American centric talk. Now, the thing to point out about this migration, it does not come without cost, because, if everybody could just capitalize on these free, abundant resources, they probably would. This was sort of really groundbreaking research in the early 2000s that sort of quantified how survival is in fact lowest during both migration periods for migratory songbirds in North America. So what that means is that it's basically very dangerous to make these big treks, across continents, which sort of makes sense. But, before this time, there was so much research was focused on the breeding grounds or the wintering grounds. We didn't quite have all this pieced together, but it's just important to know that, yes, these birds are taking advantage of some great things, but these big journeys do have some risks associated with them. And just to get a flavor of sort of North America here migration, we kind of split things up into flyways. And they're, I suppose, relatively intuitive. You have your Atlantic flyway encompassing the Atlantic coast, Mississippi flyway, our lovely home here in the Central Flyway in Nebraska, and the rest of the Great Plains all the way up through the Arctic there, and then of course the Pacific. And these flyways are broken down mostly, each flyway kind of has its own pace of migration, different species you might expect to move at certain times, relatively predictable habitats within these flyways. But it's just sort of a way that we kind of think of things, and birds do naturally follow, the coasts in the case of the Pacific and the Atlantic flyways, of course, Mississippi and some other areas of the Appalachians and so on. So this is kind of how we break down and think of migration in North America. Just some fun highlights, because these really are incredible things. So the one I always like to go to is the black-poll warbler. So that's this handsome little fella here. And for those that don't know, the black-poll warbler is about 15 grams and, like 4 or 5 inches long. So this is a tiny little bird. And, they winter in South America, and they breed up in the boreal forests of Canada and Alaska. So their spring migration takes them typically across the Gulf of Mexico and sort of through sort of central US. This is typically when we get to see black-poll warblers here in Nebraska in springtime. And they go all about the forests across the continent, the northern part of the continent there. But their fall migration, regardless of the population, whether it's like Alaska or Quebec, they all sort of funnel towards the East Coast, and it's typically somewhere between New England and kind of the mid-Atlantic. And then they take their fall migration totally across the Atlantic Ocean all the way down back to South America. So that's roughly like a 20 to 28 hour flight, depending on the conditions. And again, this bird's like that big. It weighs 15 grams and it's making a complete transatlantic flight. It's an amazing little achievement for this tiny animal. As you can imagine, it takes a lot. It's like a huge physiological challenge, not to mention that, they do this year after year. So a really cool bird I always like to highlight. This one's sort of, the champion of just distance. This is the Arctic tern. And these are some tracks from Arctic terns that were tagged out in Greenland. And as you can see, while these aren't necessarily solo migrations, Arctic terns basically cover like the entire globe. They go north to south, covering the entire Atlantic Ocean, sometimes, even more so, and around the Antarctic. So yeah, these guys travel the most. They can put down in water, so it's not exactly the same thing as the blackpoll warbler, but still, I mean, again, in a single year, this bird sees 5 different continents, goes across the entire ocean. It's just really amazing, the movements. And then we are really spoiled here in Nebraska, and I do like to remind people of that because we have one of the most visible, huge mass migrations in sandhill cranes. Not only are there, there are hundreds of thousands in this tiny little section of the Platte, but they're really big and it's like really obvious and it's just incredibly cool. So, that's far from every amazing, incredible migratory bird thing that happens, but just some that I like to always point out because it really is, variable from waterfowl, terns, warblers, cranes. It's a whole thing. Quick part 2 of this, of course, is climate change. And this is just going to be sort of a quick, I guess, just the very basics of kind of what we're seeing and what's going on. So for those gardeners among us, and I try as I might, I consider myself one, but this will probably be familiar to a lot of people. This is the plant zone hardiness map. And you can see even just since, since 1990, within 15 years, the cold areas are shrinking and moving north, and more and more hardiness zones moving up. Of course, temperature change. This is a big one that's one of the more bigger signals of this. And this is over the past century here. And you can see just as these systems are some of the simpler parts of it, at least with temperature change. We would know what we would expect from natural things that would create warming in the atmosphere. Of course, we have gone well beyond what that would naturally be. So, of course, these sort of human inputs into the system have really raised the temperature over the past 100 years. Kind of going along the similar flavor here. This is comparing the temperature trends of the 30 years or so from 1990 to the mid 2010s and comparing that to the averages from the 50 years of the turn of the 20th century. And of course, the warmer colors represent hotter than average, cooler covers, colder than average. And as you can see, this is probably not a shock to anybody. Things have been getting a lot warmer for basically the majority of the United States. Similar vibe with precipitation. We're seeing heavier precipitation events and just much more out of the ordinary precipitation. So the precipitation change also above average. This is the same comparison of years. But of course, that it's not just all rain all the time. It comes with bigger extremes. I mean, this is really happening right now, as you're probably aware. You can see in the American Southwest here, precipitation is way down since that time, and of course, massive drought going on right now in that region as well. Of course, even just more data, kind of just going along the same lines. Longer frost-free season length. Once again, bigger changes in these heavy precipitation events, particularly in the Northeast and kind of the northern Midwest. And, again, we see this really a lot, even, here at home in Nebraska. This is this year's drought monitor. This is from 2 weeks ago. Essentially the entire state more or less is in drought. I'm sure we've all seen this. So, and unfortunately, we can kind of expect more of this, or at least more of the extremes. Hotter temperatures lasting a little longer, heavier precipitation events, but much less predictable, and sadly, probably more drought in certain parts. So, just some of the basics there of the climate change going on. But the important thing about that and that data is essentially at the point in bird research, past 20 years or so, it's just kind of this realization of, hey, climate kind of affects the entire ecosystem, specifically habitat, what birds would be doing, how are birds interacting with this, what is this going to mean for birds down the line. So that's kind of the state that we're in now, heading towards looking at birds and climate change. What are the impacts that we've seen already? What can we expect? What's sort of needed to be learned yet still? So moving on, as we're talking about all this research that might be going on related to birds and climate change, just wanted to touch on some of how we even go about bird migration research in the first place, specifically the tracking of individuals and how we even get to the point of being able to say that oh yeah, this bird starts down here and goes up there. I mean, obviously we have different parts of the country that see different birds at different times. So we get the whole, things moving north and moving south. But to really connect the dots, we need individuals going from point A to point B kind of thing. So I suppose this all began that sort of sense of, I guess, the old school of just classic bird banding. For those not familiar with that, what you do is you essentially set up these tiny thin mesh nets. They're called mist nets. And you put those out and you just wait essentially for birds to fly right in. It's like a really thin net so the birds can't see them. And then they kind of hang out in the net. You pluck them out of the net and you throw on one of these aluminum bands, and each band has a unique digit combination of numbers. So, and then you let it go and you hope that somewhere down the line somebody catches that bird again. Now it's super easy, super cheap, very minimally invasive. This is like wearing like a watch or something for these birds, so it's not like super heavy or cumbersome. But the issue, as you might guess, is that your numbers and your odds of someone encountering that bird somewhere down the line who happens to have their mist net out, who happens to catch your tiny little Nashville warbler or least flycatcher here, is going to be pretty difficult. So, but this for a while was basically all we had. So this was, you'd be surprised how many like bird longevity records were established this way, and how, sort of newer migration paths were sort of discovered to traditional banding. Now, of course, the next step from that is sort of color banding or individual marker banding. And that's basically what you're relying on is people to recite the animal. You don't have to recatch it again. Makes it a little bit easier. And this really helps with sort of your bigger birds, your more obvious birds in like beach habitats. This is a piping plover that bred and was banded in Nebraska. And there you can see zoomed in, if you were using binoculars, you're like, oh, only that piping plover has, green on top of yellow on top of green on top of gray. So we would know that individual exactly, and you wouldn't need to catch it again. And in Nebraska, there's actually been lots and lots of piping plovers that have been color banded and in fact recited all across the Gulf Coast and in some cases the Atlantic coast. So we've actually been able to establish some pretty cool connections there of just where the birds are wintering and where they're coming back through. Entering into the newer technology realm, radar, in fact, tracks a lot of bird migration. So this has actually been a known commodity for a while, that birds are being picked up on radar. But nowadays, we have such advanced modeling and computing technology that the way to visualize this is super, super cool, really cool tools. This screen grab on the right here is from a thing called Birdcast, which essentially takes this radar data, weather conditions, and it can essentially forecast migration. And while you can't pick up, individual little birds going, oh, that bird started there to there, but you do pick up the entire sort of mass movements and flavor of migration. It's a really cool thing. And, these stats and these models are getting better and better. So there's some really cool tools coming out with just from the radar side of things, which is really exciting. Moving to even more techno advances, the MODIS network and nanotags. So the nice thing about these, so here's a picture of a red-eyed vireo with a nanotag. So red-eyed vireo is also very small, a little bit bigger than the black-poll warbler, but not by much. You can't really put super heavy advanced tracking things on tiny birds. We're just not there yet. But these nanotags, you can. And what these do is they send out just their own little individual coded ping kind of out like a radio frequency. And you can see these little towers in the middle, they're like little tiny cell towers. And that map there, all those little yellow dots are locations of those towers. If a bird gets within, say, 10 to 15 kilometers of one of these towers and it's wearing this tag, that tower actually pick it up. It knows that individual frequency exactly. Bada bing, bada boom, you got to track birds. So, particularly in like the Atlantic coast, the Great Lakes region has a lot of these set up, and this is slowly moving across the country. I like to think of this as sort of like just really big radio mist nets, because you're going from a 12-meter net to now 12-kilometer range. You set up enough arrays of these, and this has really gained steam the last 5, 6, 7 years. So loads of animals and birds of all sorts are getting these nanotags on them. Lots of really cool migration and connectivity projects are coming through the pipeline. So this is a really neat thing that's growing and expanding. And again, basically any species, these tags can get super, super small, to about like 0.2 of a gram. So lots and lots of birds can take these, which is really cool. Now, the gold standard, the cutting edge is satellite GPS technology. And all of 10 years ago, you couldn't really put something like this on anything smaller than like a large raptor, like a crane or something like that. Nowadays, these things keep getting smaller and smaller and faster. This is an American woodcock. This is part of a woodcock tracking project that we have going on here in Nebraska. Woodcock are a little bigger than your warblers, but they're not huge as far as shorebirds go. They're about 150 grams. You can see it in my hand there. They're not super big, but this is basically like giving a bird a cell phone. We get exact GPS to the point locations on it. It goes right up to a satellite, comes right back to our computer. That's that. It's pretty slick. It's pretty fantastic. And as you can see, this is just an animation of some birds that were tagged in last year's spring migration. They leave eastern Nebraska. We can catch them in, Minnesota. We can catch them going up to Manitoba. It's just an amazing thing. And year after year, these tags get smaller and smaller. So this is really exciting, great stuff. And, much more to come from this kind of information in the future. So we're really getting much better at tracking migration and sort of how birds are doing what they're doing. And it's really making us, reevaluate a lot about, what we think we know about birds. That's the thing about, research and science. It's like, oh yeah, we never have it. We're always surprised in very good ways. So highlighting here some case studies involving this migration, but also the climate change aspect that I think are just nice sort of illustrations of sort of the things that we're seeing. We'll start close to home, everybody's favorite, the sandhill crane. The big climate change impact here that we're seeing is essentially migration timing. So the advancing of sandhill crane migration. Cutting to the chase, basically year after year, sandhill cranes are advancing in migration about 1 day per year. So that means as they're getting to the Platte for stopover, it's earlier and earlier every year. And the whooping cranes, which of course are like a real conservation concern because there's not that many of them, very similar, migration trajectory as the sandhill cranes. Same thing as far as the Platte and the rest of their flyway, similar advances in timing. So basically with the cranes, things are getting earlier and earlier as far as it comes to their migration path to their breeding grounds. Now, for something like a crane, they're really big, pretty hardy. And we've probably actually, if you've been to see the cranes, maybe you've seen this before, a bunch of cranes standing out in the snow. It may not necessarily be the biggest thing, but, keep in mind, early March out here can be great. The weather can be awesome, but it doesn't take much. First week of April, there's a giant snowstorm. And that's just Nebraska. Moving north along these birds' migration, as they go through the plains and then up into Canada, things can get real bad up there in like mid-April. So the worry, particularly with like whooping cranes, is these birds are really getting ahead of their skis on their migration timing. They're going to just start hitting nastier and nastier weather, some sort of freak weather event because things have just not settled further up north. But with the cranes too, this is interesting because there's obviously the ecological concerns, but cranes are big ecotourism here in the States. So what was the prime time to go and see cranes, 20 years ago, you're way too late now. So, these little things are just the funny little ins and outs that you would never expect for like climate change and birds. But, that is something you have to keep in mind now, just dealing with the reality of these things changing. Back to sort of the ecology of the animals, and I alluded to it earlier, the real, I guess, like fear or concern going around with climate change and migration is this idea that things are going to be out of sync. There's going to be mismatch for these birds. So I just like to think of it as ecological mismatch. That's not necessarily a technical term. This paper here I highlight, they use a fancy word, phenological asynchrony. That's a little bit of a mouthful. The basic idea is just like things are not lined up. And again, these birds are trying to capitalize on resources up north away from where they're at, but particularly longer distance migrants, they're somewhere in the Caribbean or in Central America. They can't possibly, anticipate what's going on, say in like, Maine or something like that. So those birds are kind of fixed to their migration timing, typically with day length. So, when they arrive, things are moving a lot faster. And what this really relates to is the idea of greenups. When the vegetation is coming out, that's when all the insects during the breeding season for birds, that's food. And here's a lovely little bluebird, presumably going to feed its nestlings. But the timing of when the vegetation comes out and when the insects are coming out, the birds have evolved for a very, very long time to sort of really match that up just right, so they can, feed their young as best as possible, maybe raise a second brood, things like that. But that greenup is getting further and further out of whack with the bird migration. So hopefully this animation works, but this is just this spring's leaf out index. And as it gets going here, the warmer colors again are ahead of the average, what we would expect. The cooler colors are behind. Each year's a little bit different, but the general trend is what you're seeing here, which is that essentially, particularly in the east and the northeast, and then when you get into the Midwest, central Midwest, greenup is happening earlier and earlier and earlier and like way ahead of schedule kind of thing. So always something interesting to keep track of year after year. But again, like this phenomenon, it's actually created the best study on this, the one I highlighted earlier, is that birds are now like a day behind what they usually are when it comes to getting to the breeding grounds, which doesn't sound like much to us, but that does matter a lot to a tiny little bird. So arriving at these breeding grounds out of sync can be a real problem. And a real great research project that really got at the meat and potatoes of this, working with this species here. This is a Hudsonian Godwit, delightful shorebird, much bigger than the woodcock that I was talking about earlier. And these guys really migrate. So their wintering grounds is like the southern part of South America, and they go all the way up to the Arctic. So we do get them through, particularly the eastern part of Nebraska, starting about a week ago or so. There still should be a few around maybe, but yeah, these guys are amazing and they're gorgeous. But what this paper really did, focusing again on these mismatches, is it looked at two separate populations of Godwits, one in Alaska, one in northern Manitoba. And these populations are sort of on different trajectories. The Alaska population holding steady, the Manitoba birds not looking really good at all. It was kind of unclear what was going on there. As it turns out, for the Alaska population, the Godwits their chicks were hatching just before like insect peak was hitting, which is really what you want, because as your chicks in the nest get older and older, they get bigger and bigger, they need more food. So you want that insect peak to be timed right about when your chicks are at their largest level and about ready to fledge. You can keep them nice and satisfied, and they can fledge and get off, and you got yourself a successful nest. Turns out in the Churchill population, most of the nests were actually hatching right in the middle of the peak of insects. Meaning, yeah, it's great when they're really, really tiny and they just hatch. There's plenty of food to go around. But as those birds get older and older in the nest, we're already on the downslope of where all the insects are coming out. So it was harder and harder to feed those older and older birds. So those birds the Churchill population is just out of sync again with those insects. And what's interesting about that situation in particular is they were in fact delayed by the longer and harsher winters. I think when we think climate change, we go to like global warming, which, climate change is just, things are just moving out of whack. So it doesn't always mean for everywhere things are super hot. In that part of subarctic Canada, the winters are getting like worse and worse and longer. And then on top of that, it's still getting wicked hot, wicked fast. So there's like basically no downtime between things. So winter's longer, insects are coming out faster, and yeah, the birds are feeling it. It's a little abstract, but I actually worked with a breeding population of Savannah sparrows in Churchill a few years back. And, this is kind of what you would typically expect, right? Breeding, it's, the subarctic, and this picture was taken in July. This bird did great, by the way, raised young. We were all very happy. But, this is July. This is middle of June. And as you can see, that's a lot of snow. What you can't see is that's like a foot of snow. that willow bush that's all wilted there is about the same height as the willow bush that the bird on the left is. And those birds had already arrived basically 1st of June. They're waiting 2-3 weeks. Not a lot of great resources around. And then of course it gets warm super fast. So yes, these are sparrows, these are not the Godwits, but the same principles apply. And when you start getting really, really far north into the Arctic, you do not have a lot of time to raise young. The margin of error is so small. And I can tell you the the extremes are really coming out there. The warm is getting way too warm, the colds are getting way too cold. So yeah, like this is like the kind of asynchrony. It's not only insects are coming out too soon, it's also weather's just getting way too weird for birds to be matching this up. And obviously they haven't evolved to, be ready for crazy swings like this. So it should come as no surprise that, our most vulnerable birds here in North America, highly concentrated way up north, you have your Arctic species and your boreal forest birds, that's where there's still forest before you hit tundra. So that group is super, super at risk. And you can see why. And it's just something to now be really cognizant of going forward as sort of the scientific community. And of course, what happens in one season can definitely have impacts on the next season. So now, we're talking breeding season, breeding's all done, going into fall migration. Now, when it comes to fall migration and climate, things are fall migration is just a whole different flavor than spring. There's not quite that impetus to get there super, super fast. Birds have a little more leeway. They don't have all the time in the world, but things are a little more fluid. However, climate is still climate and the habitats are still the habitat. And the real advance in, I would say, fall migration research has been in physiology and nutrition and dietary stuff for birds. And really the last 15, 20 years, we've seen just this awesome amount of research, namely into fat and antioxidants and things like that, because birds fuel their migrations on fat. So that little black warbler that, he has to go across the Atlantic Ocean, he's going to put on as much fat as it can physically carry and still fly with. Because, when you're halfway over the ocean, you still want to be burning lots and lots of fuel. So we've really seen some really cool stuff with this, but, where they're going to get that fat is on their migration journeys, in different habitats. They need to fuel up and get that food. We looked at this a little bit here in Nebraska, past couple years, working with game and parks. And we essentially looked at the condition and diversity of migratory birds that we were seeing moving through our state in fall. And, you can actually measure the fat of these birds. That's what this little picture is. Non-invasively, you just blow away their feathers. You see the little yellow mass underneath, you measure the fat. And we just wanted to get a sense of, okay, our birds, when they're using Nebraska, trying to get back to the wintering grounds, are they fattening up? Are they doing well? Or, are things not looking so good? We did catch many, many diverse birds, which is good. And I would say in most cases, if you have a lot of diversity going on, your habitat's looking pretty sweet, especially in migration. These are a lovely collection of warblers. And then this chart's a little busy, but essentially birds were putting on more fat when they were hanging out in Nebraska, which was good, at least the location where we were catching the birds. So we found some really good stuff there. And again, what this is all tied to is what the birds are feeding on at the habitat where they arrive. So I highlight here, this is some dogwood, some lovely little berries, usually lots of fat, sometimes some other nutrients in those berries, really good. Also this diversity of forbs and shrubs all kind of together with the goldenrod, sunflower, et cetera, that, there's going to be some different kinds of insects going on in there. It gives the birds more things to munch on as they move south. So where that really connects to climate, as you might expect, is you still got to have the right climate for these kind of plants. And, for these things to be hanging out, particularly the native plants, because in fall, if birds are eating the non-native berries, their nutrition's not going to be where it should be. So I understand that was a lot. They're just trying to couch in as much migration stuff as we could in every little aspect, but kind of the thing to think going forward, it can all be very daunting, right? Oh my gosh, there's these huge problems, there's these birds, what are we going to do? What I hope to just show is that it's not all lost, but there's also just progress being made in lots of different areas. So starting off on all these different areas, I'd say still the most important thing right now is kind of awareness and information and data. There's still so much we need to know and can find out. And the way to start is to just sort of, again, get a sense of what's going on. So Audubon has this neat little tool with the Birds and Climate Visualizer. It's over 300 species. Essentially what you do, pick your favorite bird. We'll go with Henslow's sparrow because they're a nice one out in the prairies of eastern Nebraska. And you can check out their range and what's going on with their population here under the current climate scenarios. But of course, you can then project under very probable warming scenarios, and you see like where the range shrinks, where where they might expand, usually it shrinks. So, while you can't, what this will help with is like you just get a sense of like, oh man, when you start putting together, multiple species in grasslands, say, or you start looking at multiple boreal breeding birds, and you start to see what like where everything's going, just kind of helps put everything in the context of like, oh man, like this could be what we're looking at. But like I said, progress has been made, sometimes in unexpected ways. I like to highlight where like economics and habitat and helping out things have made an impact. Everybody likes coffee, I assume, I would hope. But there's this certification called bird-friendly coffee. So we're talking about now, like think Central America, South America. This is where our breeding birds are wintering. And it turns out a lot of our birds really like coffee plantations for one reason or another. Tennessee warblers, tanagers, a lot of flycatchers, wood thrush, just really hang out there. So people start figuring this out. It's like, hey, we should really make this habitat as best as we can without just telling people they can't, make coffee. So this photo is in fact a bird-friendly coffee farm. And I know people think like organic or shade. Trust me, it's like shade coffee to the max because it's basically just dense forest. And there is in fact coffee plants underneath all those trees. You just can't really see them because it's mostly just trees. So, and again, this is something what's cool about it is like 15 years ago, there was like one or two of these. Now there's a bajillion brands that are doing bird-friendly coffee. So that's really good. Now here at home, we have all these huge, especially grassland burns, big threats. We have all these working lands that Audubon has now started this initiative of similar kind of thing, getting like a bird-friendly certification for, say, your beef or your grazers. Again, this isn't like, if you get 10 friends to sign up for bird-friendly coffee, 10 years down the line, you'll make 20% more profits. I'm not trying to sell this whatever on anybody, but it's just, I think we often consider, like agriculture and conservation and economics, like these very separate at odds things. But in fact, I think it was just, they weren't really communicating. Like nobody was really, and before you know it, like there's some really good work happening here. And this program keeps expanding. And it's kind of a win-win for everybody. Like it's a very, consistent economics, and it's good for the habitat, good for the birds, good for the grazers. I think it's a win, and it's nice to see this progress happening. Other initiatives that have been really making a difference are Lights Out initiative. Also the Dark Skies initiative, very similar. And essentially what this is, again, most of these little birds are migrating at night. And if you think back to how they evolved their migration routes, you're looking at a night sky that has all sorts of constellations, things, etc. And then all of a sudden now there's Chicago, and that's a little different. So, unfortunately, this is actually a really big threat to birds. When big lights are on in a city, especially super tall buildings, that's the altitude birds are flying. They get disoriented, bad things happen. However, these Lights Out initiatives, using that sort of really cool technology of predicting migration, when it looks like a big migratory night, cities that are involved in this, they really dim the lights or turn off most of them because it's after hours, businesses aren't going on. There's a shot of Philadelphia, they're doing this. And yeah, you just have way less bird strike mortalities the next day. So this is something great if you live in a city that has this. If not, you can kind of get this going. Getting real micro scale things like you can do that can help. You got a little yard or anything, just like plant some native shrubs and flowers. First off, your pollinators are going to be super happy. That's always good. Everybody likes pollinators. But the birds are going to love it too. You can search like what are good places for where you live. There's all sorts of resources. You can just contact local nursery. I'm sure they know, but you can just do it as simple as like, hey, what's like native here, and just plant that. Some regions of the country. So I have this is from the New England area, but they went like whole hog into this, and we're looking now at like how many fat and antioxidant properties, and like what are the, if you really want to get in the weeds on it, you could like, super plant that based on your region. That's not everywhere, but sure, why not? But if you're in New England right now, plant some Arrowwood by Burnham, the birds are gonna love it. So these are just little things. And at the end of the day, just go birding, go check out some cool birds doing cool stuff, get involved in some sort of community science project. We just had a great plug for iNaturalist. it definitely helps. Might be worth doing. There's things like eBird, these other initiatives like, say, Climate Watch, got the Christmas bird count. All these community science projects, this is like data that we just need. Like I said, we can always use it. And again, just the idea of, go outside and you see like a Swainson's thrush, and it's like, oh my gosh, 12 days ago, that bird was like in Honduras or something. It's just like amazing. It's amazing to just think how these things can happen. And it's like year after year, season after season, these amazing tiny little birds. Obviously, they're super aesthetically pleasing, but it's just this like massive event that's happening year after year. And it's just always worthwhile to just sort of have that awareness and get jazzed about it. I mean, it's May 10th. It's like the time to be out and about checking out birds. So I hope some of you have gotten out, and if you haven't, go for it. This talk will be over soon. There's probably some daylight left. Check out, listen for some birds. You might even hear some birds migrating at night. The sun start going down. It's a clear night. Birds, you can just hear them going by and doing this incredible thing. So anyway, that was a lot. Hopefully it got everyone excited about migration and maybe a little more info about migration. Thank you again so much for coming. I'd be happy to take any questions. Summer tanager, how could you not like it? Thank you again.
That was fabulous. Thank you, Steve. Oh man, we do have some questions. I'm going to throw mine out first. And I'm going to say thank you for the plugs for community science. And I want to plug that again, because if you want to help, like something that you can do is gather data. And if you have any questions about what community science is, or any community science projects that you're interested in, I am nebraska.gov. My email is in the chat. What is the significance of antioxidants when you're talking about,
Yeah, so this is something of an emerging field, but as you can expect, flying like 20 hours straight creates a lot of damage in the body. So the advantage probably of having antioxidants for these birds is they can repair this damage as they go. And again, we're getting real into the physiology weeds here, but thinking of fat as the main fuel resource. In fact, reactive species, which are kind of the thing you're looking out for, even in like humans, oxidation and so on, they really go at fat molecules first. They're really vulnerable to that. So if you can have a food source that's both fatty but also has some antioxidants, is not only can you repair just general body damage of that kind of intense exercise, but you're actually protecting a little bit your fuel source as well, which is all that fat. So the big thing is repair and recovery. So again, geez, I'm a tiny little bird. I'm like 12 grams. I just flew 12 hours straight last night. I could really use some berries with some antioxidants to just again, a lot of damage going on in the body. And that's why stopover is so important for these birds. So that was a remarkably simplistic version of what's going on there, but essentially it's to help the birds recover from exercise.
Vitamins.
Yeah, lots and lots of vitamins.
They need the vitamins. Thank you. That was great. Let's see, what do we in the chat here? How does changing land use affect migratory patterns, like growth of human development in urban areas, agricultural development, and other ways, engineering?
Excellent. Yeah, so that's a good sort of transition from this idea of, you need lots and lots of these food availabilities for these birds to recover after migration and eat. Obviously, if those patches of suitable habitat along the migration route are shrinking, again, it's kind of back to that margin of error thing. If you're not hitting your mark, yes, are you out in open ocean necessarily? No, but if you are flying over like a vast expanse that's just like a cornfield and nothing else in there, for a bird, that can be really hard. That's not going to have the nutrition that, say, a blackpoll warbler or, a Nashville warbler or something's going to need to fuel up. It can land and it can rest, but that's about it. So, as more habitats kind of removed, it just makes it way more dangerous for the birds. And where that really comes into play is if you are in an area that's like a major migratory corridor, say like along the Missouri River, Mississippi River, on the Gulf Coast, that's where birds are really coming in after big journeys. And if that keeps getting developed, you're really in trouble. So hopefully that answered that question.
Thank you. Are there any theories or evidence that's been gathered or suggesting like that nesting ranges are starting to, like the birds are adapting? Like what say you on
Yes. Let's say yes. Yeah, bird, lots of different regions, frankly, using like community science data because, you know, yes, it wasn't all digitized back in, 1960, what have you, but, there were still birders out there and people were taking notes. So we've actually been able to see in a lot of different regions where, species that weren't nesting there before are nesting there. But unfortunately that, comes at a cost that, say, if you're a little further down in the breeding range of something, that bird's probably not breeding there anymore just because it's getting warmer and warmer. I think like Baltimore Orioles is kind of the sort of mascot for this, because probably pretty soon they won't like be nesting in Baltimore or around that area of Maryland. But where that gets really interesting is in elevational gradients and that kind of research. We always think of migration north to south, but in a lot of areas, even here in North America, migration is going from warm to, moving up to where things are happening up on the mountains. And that's really where you see this sort of shifting up and up. And much like, for an Arctic bird, mountain's not going to get much taller and the Arctic's not going to get much bigger. So yeah, we are seeing that. It was the short answer to that question.
Right. But and then like you would think that there'd be like competition too if they're changing, that would be right. So
yeah, there's just not
a
as
good
much
thing that they're adapting.
And then where this is being meeting up too is shorter distance migrants, so birds that winter like in the continental US, but also breed a little further north, say winter in like Arkansas or Louisiana, but breed up in Wisconsin. They're actually picking up their speed a lot. They're keeping up with these changes a lot more. But again, that's going to run into trouble when you have all these birds from South America who haven't been figuring that out. And different mechanisms are at play there. So yeah, it could get messy. We'll see.
We have a hardcore bird nerd that is watching this presentation and is out at Cornhusker Wildlife Management right now birding. So
good. Great. All right. Are you seeing good? Hopefully good migration is happening. I imagine it is. I'm hoping for you, but best of luck. I naturalist that.
Yes, make sure you have iNaturalist and take pictures, and you can record the sounds, and those will become part of the bird blitz for Nebraska Bird Month. Denise is like, yep, I'm on it. So Jennifer, if you're still on, she was asking about a website that you first talked about. Maybe unmute yourself, Jennifer, and give a little bit more description of the website, and then he might be able to.
Yes, I didn't catch that website when you first started.
What was
like the subject matter, I guess?
Yeah, that we could go to, or the app off the website.
To find
I can't remember. Was it the Nebraska? I didn't catch it all, so I was going to write it down that you were talking about.
Steve or I?
Oh, it was you. I'm sorry, Jamie. It was you when you first started.
iNaturalist?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I thought
I couldn't remember. So you just type, okay.
Yeah, iNaturalist.org.
.org. Okay.
Mm-hmm, yep. And my email's in the chat. If you have any questions, just email me.
Okay.
And I'll do my best. It's a busy time of year, so.
Yeah, to get more involved, I couldn't remember the website.
Let's see. So Hall and Howard County, the landscape is changing. Trees are being cleared for planting. I'm sure you're reading this. I'm just reading it for you, I guess. From February this year, it has picked up up in time for planting season. So are you aware of any research regarding the removal of trees and bird population ratio?
Not sure of like a direct ratio of like X number of trees gone directly related to populations of birds gone, but I do think that plays into the general idea of, if you're removing habitat, whether it be migratory stopover locations or possible breeding spots, that is going to have an impact. And I think on a broad scale that research has been done, looking at things like in the eastern US, like early successional forests and the decline of that habitat and how that's impacted migratory birds. That kind of work though usually happens on rather large scales because we're talking like decade or more looking at, because it does take a little bit of time for that to sort of echo into, because birds, depending on the species, some of them like to go back to where they bred before. In this case, say they are breeding right by where these trees were just cleared. They'll probably figure it out if there's something nearby, but like that impact's not going to be right away because they haven't been there yet. So it usually takes a little bit of time, and on like a macro scale, that stuff has been looked at. I'm not sure though of like a direct smaller scale, ratio study.
Oh, we do. Let's see. Can you talk about the bird flu that is becoming so widespread, and are these things vector-based or zoonotic, and what the extent and to what extent are migratory birds being affected or carriers?
So I am aware of the bird flu going around and the problems. It's a big one this year. I am not technically qualified, really. I shouldn't say I'm not technically qualified. I am not qualified to answer the specifics about, like the pathways of transmission and things like that for avian influenza going around right now. I depending on the species, it matters of which birds are affected or care. We kind of don't know. I mean, we definitely know in like things like waterfowl and, unfortunately, like certain raptors that particularly prey on waterfowl, that's obviously a problem. I do think it's a bit of an unknown, a lot of the species, but it's probably best to just presume it definitely can happen. But, depending on how much they congregate, habitat, things like that. But, beyond probably what is out there information wise about, particularly with waterfowl, raptors, and what's going on, I can't really speak too much to that. That's a little outside my realm of expertise. So sorry about that.
So we're coming up on 4 minutes left in the hour, and I want to make sure I'm respecting everyone's time. Are there any last minute questions that anyone would like to ask? And if my email is in the chat. So, and Steve is.
Yeah, let me put mine in.
Steve's throwing his in there, so you can always email if something comes up.
All right.
Again, thanks so much. That was super great.
Thank you, Jamie, for hosting
Well
this.
done.
Thank you,
well
everybody,
done.
for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. That was great. I'll be sending out an email hopefully in the next couple of days. A survey and an email, and just to see how you feel about it. Get some feels. Let's take all the data. Awesome. All the love in the chat for you, Steve.
It's a team effort.
No, that's not true.
No, very much.
All right, friends, if there are no other questions, go outside and go birding.
Yes.
Because it's happening. It's all over the place. Thanks, friends. It was nice to meet you. Thanks for coming.
Cheers.
Bye, guys.